Well, good morning. Happy Resurrection Sunday. We're glad that you're here with us this morning, whether in person or joining us online. How many of you came back from Florida this weekend and in the room? The rest of us were losers, okay? We're just kind of left behind, but we're glad that you're with us. We're going to be in Genesis 22. If you have a Bible with you, Genesis 22 is where we're going to spend our morning. Last week, my family and I, we spent just a couple days in Detroit, and one of the things that we did when we were there is we went to the Henry Ford Museum. How many of you have ever been to the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit? It's a pretty incredible museum. We spent an entire day there. There's all sorts of incredible cars to see and huge trains, and so our kids really enjoyed it. But there was also a couple exhibits that brought about conversation in our family. And one of those exhibits was on segregation. You see, at the museum, they have Rosa Parks, the original bus that she was on, to take a stand on December 1st, I think it was 1955, and Ford bought it for $500,000. They redid the whole thing, and you can get inside the bus and sit there, and they have a little tour guide there that'll give you a little story about the bus and what took place that day and where Rosa sat on the bus. And so it was super informational to be a part of that and see that. But then they also had this section of this waiting room that had a white entrance and a black entrance, and it had a white drinking fountain and a black drinking fountain. And so for our family, having 3 adopted black children, it was a time for us to have very intentional conversation as a family. And we're trying to explain what was happening in the 50s and how what's happened in the 50s is not happening today, even though there's, of course, always growth to be had and just some of those kind of conversations. But my youngest son, Johnny, who's 7, he actually says this. He says, "Why won't they let us in?" Think about that. He wasn't talking about his parents. He was talking about his siblings. Why won't they let us in? You see, in that moment, we had to meet him where he was, right, and help him understand that while there's growth to be had, our country's growing in significant ways, and you can go wherever you want to go, my son. See, there was desperation in that question. The question we want to wrestle with this morning is this: what do you desperately need God to provide? And this morning we're going to say that each and every one of us we desperately need a way. We need a way in, we need a way through, we need a way up, we need a way out, we need a way together. And when Johnny made his statement at the museum, he was looking for a way in. Maybe you're here this morning and you have some health struggles and you're looking for a way out. Or maybe in your marriage, you're looking for a way together. Or maybe you're here in your job, you're looking for a way up. You see, maybe you're here and you feel so lost, you're not even sure which way to actually turn. Let me be clear that each and every one of us, whether you know it or not, are actually desperate for a very clear and specific way. And our heartbeat this morning is for you to see clearly what that way actually is. As we jump back into Genesis and look at the story of Abraham, who's been on this long journey with God, we're going to look at the most well-known story in Abraham's life. And we're going to see that he's going to find himself in a position where he desperately needs a way. And even in Genesis 22, the first book of the Bible, we're going to see the importance of the resurrection. And so let's take a look at it, reading Genesis 22 as we process what do we desperately need God to provide for us. Let's take a look at the story starting in verse 1. It says, "After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham,' and he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains from which I will tell you.' So Abraham rose early in the morning. He saddled his donkey. He took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering and rose and went to the place where God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, 'Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there, worship, and will come again to you.' And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son. He took in his hand the fire and the knife, so they both went of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, 'My father.' And he said, 'Here I am, my son.' He said, 'Behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering?' And Abraham said, 'God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son.' So they went, both of them, together. When they came to the place which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there. He laid the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son, and he laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand. He took his knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on that boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket of the thorns. And Abraham went. He took the ram, offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And so I'm going to make two observations that communicate our desperation this morning. And here's the first. You don't have what you need. What you need, you don't have. You see, over the first 8 verses, we can start in verse 1, learning about this story actually here. But we know that Abraham had for 25 years been following God, and God has constantly been repeating his promise to Abraham over and over and over again. He actually told them, I'm going to bless you as numerous as the stars are in the sky. I'm going to bless you as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And after 25 years of following God, we saw last week that God delivered on his promise as Abraham at 100 years old and Sarah at 90 years old and barren gave birth to a baby boy named Isaac. Now Genesis 22, Isaac is now a teenager. And the text starts by telling us something very important. After these things, it says, God tested Abraham. You see, there's something important for us to understand. As we read the difficulty of this story, you and I need to know this. God wants you to know it was a test. This was a test. You see, here's the thing. We read the story knowing it's a test. Abraham lived the story knowing that this was actually reality for him. But the truth is, as we follow Abraham's story, as he faces this test, we learn something very important, and that is this. A growing faith is a tested faith. A growing faith is absolutely a tested faith. And so why does God actually do this? Here's the point. God will stretch your faith beyond human limits to actually increase your faith and make you more like him. And so what God is going to do is he's going to push Abraham to a place of desperation, a place where he needs God to do something that only he can actually do. And so what is the test? We read it in verse 1 and 2, but God gives them 3 commands. I want you to take, I want you to go, and I want you to offer. Do you see that? Take your only son. Go to the land I'm going to tell you, and then offer him up as a burnt offering to me. It's a crazy, crazy story that's happening right here. But I also want you to notice what God says in verse 2. It's a short phrase that's incredibly important. He says, take your son, your only son. Look at the next 3 words. Whom you love, God says. By the way, I think this is the first place in the whole Bible the word love actually appears. And so it's fascinating that God says, I'm going to test Abraham. And then he tells Abraham, take your son, whom you love. In other words, the framing of the test was this, is that God is going to test the very thing that Abraham loves the most. That's what tests do. That's what his tests challenge in our life. And we've seen Abraham in very weird positions throughout his life. But here's the thing. If I'm Abraham and I hear this test, that you want me to sacrifice my son, do you think Abraham would have some questions? I think he'd have a few. Hey God, we waited 25 years for the promise of this son. You promised, you're the one who casted a vision over our lives. It wasn't our idea that you're going to bless us and make our name great and give us crazy offspring. Also, the Savior is going to come from his family line. Like, that would never happen if I sacrifice my son today, God. So if I sacrifice my son, the promise and the blessing dies with them. That's the challenge in front of Abraham. Hey, church, sometimes the very thing that God asks us to do is the thing that makes the least amount of sense. right? And that's true right here for Abraham. In fact, when we followed his story, if you've been with us, we've seen there's been times when Abraham has cared more about the dream, the blessing, and the promise than he actually has God. And we've seen him and Sarah, his wife, attempt to manufacture, right, the promise and the blessing to become reality for them, actually apart from God. But the tests of God that he gives us challenge very important things in our lives, because the test that God gives you is going to challenge who or what you actually love most. In other words, the testing of God is going to challenge who's king of your life. And Abraham had two options. It could be the dream, the blessing, and the promise that God offered him, or it could be God himself. But whatever is king in your life, please know you're going to make continual sacrifices to that thing. And so Abraham has to decide who's going to be king of his life. Now, let me be honest with you. Being a pastor for 18 years and growing up in West Michigan and watching the Christian church in our city, if I could be honest, I would just say it this way. I think for us, oftentimes, we love the blessings of God more than we love God himself. We prefer his blessing. We prefer his stuff. But here's what God does. God uses tests to bring us to the end of ourselves. He creates desperation in us. So what does Abraham do? He tells God no, right? Nope. In verse 3, Abraham rose early in the morning. He saddled the donkey. He took two other young men with him. He took his son Isaac. He got wood for the burnt offering. He arose and he went to the place that God told him. Think about this. There was no delayed obedience. It was an immediate obedience to the Lord. There was no hesitation in his response. Abraham has been asked by God to do the unthinkable. And so we're learning something about Abraham that I wonder is true of you. You see, Abraham cared less about the dream, the blessing, and the promise, and he cared most about the God behind the dream, the blessing, and the promise. Is that you? You see, Abraham, we're learning a lot about him, and he's kind of made some terrible decisions in his life, and I'm looking at this decision, maybe the greatest test he could ever face. And it's interesting that God is waiting towards the end here for him to face this test, but it's an unthinkable test, and here's what he's saying. God, I'd rather have you than have the dream. All these years, only caring about the dream. Now, he only cares about what God wants him to actually do. You see, we can make the observation, this sacrifice makes no sense, humanly speaking. I'm sure on his journey with his son Isaac, whose name means laughter, who's probably brought all sorts of laughter in his life, I'm sure they're having questions and debate and conversation about what's about to take place. I'm sure Isaac has questions as well, but I wonder if Abraham's laughter actually turned to sorrow. Do you think Abraham felt helpless here? Do you think any part of him would actually feel hopeless? I wonder if he thought there'd ever be another way to actually accomplish what God wants. So I really have to sacrifice my only son who I love so deeply? You see, Abraham trusted that God was going to work it out for his good. And why does he have such trust and such confidence? Look at verse 5. It says, then Abraham said to the young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and will come to you again. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And so they both of them went together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. He said, here I am, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them together. And so notice Abraham's confidence here. What did he tell the two men that traveled with him? He said this, we're going to go forward, we're going to worship, and we're going to come back together. How can he say that? How could Isaac actually come back? Abraham's not in charge of the outcome. Abraham can't dictate what will actually happen here. He's actually completely helpless, and Isaac is actually helpless too. What do you think Isaac actually needs? I think Isaac needs a way out. I think Isaac is trying to find a way through to get out of this situation is what he's trying to figure out. But here's the thing. There was no substitute for Isaac. He had no power to overturn this idea that God actually has. He doesn't have the power to rise from the dead. Isaac couldn't do it. So Isaac asked a very important question in verse 7. Did you catch it? He said, we have wood and we have fire, but where's the lamb for the offering? And look at what Abraham says in verse 8. He says this, that God himself will provide the sacrifice. God himself will provide it. Hey, church, I think oftentimes we're so helpless and hopeless at times in our own sin. And guess what we do? We search the world to try to find something to fill that void. And we search, and here's the point. That cycle is going to continue in your life until you actually turn to Jesus and turn to him, the one who is the giver of life, and he can fill you, and he's the one of hope. And we look all over the world for these things, and we can learn watching Abraham that we can be helpless at times, but here's the thing. That's never going to change until we turn to a hopeful God. You see, Abraham knew something that we need to know, that what he needed was not found in himself. It was not found in the world. It could actually only be found in the Lord. So what have you been searching for? Because in John 10:10, Jesus says this, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. What is Jesus saying? I have come that all people may have life and have it to the full. Jesus is saying this, I'm the only one who can actually fill your life. And until you come to me, the cycle of desperation and hopelessness is going to continue in your heart and in your life until you actually turn to me. Now look at our world. Our world is like addictions are at an all-time high. Literally, an addiction is an obsession with self. We're obsessed with trying to find power, position, possessions, pleasure, and we keep filling our life with these kinds of things, hoping that it will give us the hope that we're actually looking for. But the reason is, the thing that's crazy is we keep moving from thing to thing because those things have never actually filled us in the way that we need to be filled. So put yourself in Abraham's shoes, because I think there's two observations I would make. There's actually two options if I'm Abraham. Option one is this: obey God and my son dies. Option two, disobey God and my son lives. Those are the two options, that's it. Here's the crazy part though. Abraham believes a third option. He doesn't believe option one and he doesn't believe option two. He believes the third option, which is actually this: obey God and my son will live. Like that's an option that doesn't seem to actually fit. And why would he have that kind of confidence? He said in verse 5, I and the boy will go worship and will come back to you. Isaac asks, where's the lamb for the sacrifice? And he says this, God himself will provide the lamb. Why does he have this confidence? Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 17 says this, by faith Abraham, when tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And he considered that God was able to even raise him from the dead, from which figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. And so notice that Abraham will do whatever God asks him to do, even if it makes no sense. Why? Because even if he kills his son, even if he goes through with what God said to do, he knows this, that God could actually raise his son from the dead. He entrusted God to do the impossible in his life. And why would he trust God to actually do that? The answer is because he's seen him do the impossible in his life. He saw his own wife give birth to a baby at 90 years old who was barren. God broke through that barrier, so certainly he's saying he'll break through this barrier because he's going to keep his promise no matter what. Think about Abraham's faith and trust. He thought that God could do something that's never been done yet in human history at this point. There's no example in the first 21 chapters of Genesis of God raising anyone from the dead. Yet Abraham believed his God could actually do it. You see, this story reminds us of something important, that you and I don't have what we actually need, that we are all desperate for a rescue, and the only rescue, place that we can actually find rescue, is in the person, the work of Jesus, who died on the cross, and 3 days later rose out of the grave, and he declared victory over sin and death for each and every person, which then means that those of us who are sinners, like me, if you're like me, a sinner, right, that Jesus is the only one who can give you life. What do we desperately need God to provide? The answer is resurrection. That's what we need. Here's the second thing we'll see this morning. What God has is what you need. Look at the story with me in verse 8. At the end of verse 8, it says, so they went both of them together, and when they came to the place which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there, laid the wood in order, bound Isaac his son, laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was the ram caught in the thicket of the thorns. And Abraham went, took the ram, offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son Isaac. So Abraham called this place, the Lord will provide. So here's the thing. Abraham and Isaac go up to the sacrifice together. I wonder if that was a silent walk or if that was a busy conversation. What do we see Abraham do? He builds the altar, he bounds his son, he puts his son on top of the altar. Here's the question I have. Why is there not conflict here? I mean, think about it. Isaac's a teenage boy. Abraham is old. Like you breathe on him and he falls over kind of old, right? And so why is Isaac saying, Dad, this is not how this is gonna go. Dad, I'm not gonna allow this to actually happen. Why doesn't he take a stand for himself right here? Why does he not physically overwhelm his dad? You see, we see something crazy, that Abraham trusts his heavenly father and Isaac trusts his earthly father. When we were in Detroit last week, we went to a place called the Lego Discovery Center. I don't know if any of you have ever taken your kids there, but it's a place you can spend about a couple of hours, and our kids really had a good time there. But one of the first things we did in there is we went on this ride. And it's kind of like the Toy Story ride at Disney, if you've ever done that ride, where you have this gun to shoot and it keeps score for you of what actually takes place, except on this ride, it's a Lego ride. And so you're trying to rescue the Lego princess. And so we all have our guns out and we're shooting, and I'm riding with my boys in a car, and Steph is riding behind me, right, with my daughter Maya. And the boys and I are rescuing the princess by shooting all the bad Lego people, and our score is racking up. Right? Now, I told my boys, you can combine your scores, you're still not gonna beat me, all right? And it was true, that's what happened. But we get off the ride, right? And we're waiting for Steph and Maya to get off the ride, and Steph gets off the ride all arrogant. Yeah, I got it. Like, she thinks her score is so awesome, and she's kind of all up in my grill about it. And I just had to think, for a husband, is this a good time for me just to let her have this one? Do I love her in such a way? I'm like, oh, babe, that's such a great score. You did a really good job. Or do I need to tell her that I doubled her score? And I thought, I'm going to choose I'm going to tell her that I doubled her score, right? And so I told her, no, listen, that's a good job, babe, up top. You did really well there, but here's the thing. You're not very good at this game because you don't have the skills that you need. You need my skills, right? You see, she didn't have it. She didn't have what she needed. Abraham is just obeying God. He doesn't have what he needs to dictate the outcome of the story. And so we get to verse 10, and we actually see one of the most intense scenes, I believe, in the whole Bible. A very intense scene. Isaac on the altar bound. Abraham pulling back a knife. And it says in the text, to slaughter his son. Do you think that he was shaking when he brought back that knife? Do you think Abraham was sweating? Do you think he would have been praying, hey, God, if you're going to come through for me, this is the moment. Right now, I could really use your help to come through in this moment to help save my son. And before he comes down with the knife on his son, there's a voice from heaven. The angel of the Lord yells, Abraham, Abraham. And he says, here I am. Here I am. Which, by the way, is the third time Abraham has said that in this story. For a third time, Abraham says, here I am. All three times are out of a father-son relationship. Twice, Abraham with his relationship with the Heavenly Father, and once with his relationship with his own son. But I think one of the most beautiful parts of this whole story to me is that, yes, God stops him from sacrificing his son. But if I go back to verse 1, it tells us that God tested Abraham. And the word for God there, the name for God there, is the name Elohim, which is the same name in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created. As he spoke creation into existence, as he spoke creation into being, it's that same God who is so involved in every intricate part of creation that's intimately involved with Abraham on a personal level. That's wild to me. Why would he care about Abraham? Doesn't he have other things to do, like bigger things to do? Yet when we see Abraham being stopped, we see that it's the angel of the Lord who shouted from heaven. The word Lord there, the name is Yahweh. It's God's personal name, that Abraham has a personal relationship with the Lord. And by the way, the angel of the Lord also has another name that we would know him as, and that is the name Jesus. It's Jesus who's actually stopping Abraham from slaughtering his own son. Why? He has a personal relationship with God. How do we know that Abraham has a personal relationship with God? Hey, church, God speaks, he listens. God commands, he obeys. There it is. And what does the angel of the Lord say? He says, I know that you fear God. I know that you won't even hold your own son back from me. You stand in awe of me as Lord. Listen, Abraham had a personal relationship with God. Do you have a personal relationship with him? And so what happens next after the story? Abraham lifts up his voice, sees that there's a ram. And what did God do? God provided a substitute. Now, if you've been with us in the book of Genesis, you know that God has come through again for Abraham. He's come through again and again and again for Abraham, over and over and over again in his own life, that Jesus provided the substitute for Isaac so the ram could die in his place. Think about the beauty of what's actually happening here. You see, I think we have a picture of the gospel that's important to see. Let me highlight two. One is this, is that God provides the lamb. God provides the lamb. Here's the second picture of the gospel we see that's really important to understand. And that is this, is that the lamb dies so the boy can live. Is that not the gospel? God provides the substitute. God provides the lamb. And then the lamb dies so the boy can actually live. And so you think about Isaac, right, being stuck on an altar, and God provides a substitute, which means this, that Isaac did not have to face the reality of the hell of physically dying, just like you and I, through Christ, is our substitute, don't have to face the reality of eternal hell that we actually all deserve. Same God who provided the substitute for Isaac provides the substitute for you. Our gospel takeaway this morning is this, is that Jesus' resurrection is your only way to life. By the way, there are so many gospel comparisons between Isaac and Jesus, it's actually insane. It's almost every verse here in Genesis 22, but let me highlight like 10 of them. All right? Think about this. Both Isaac and Jesus fulfilled prophecy, fulfilled promises. Isaac in Genesis 12:3, Jesus in Genesis 3:15, when God said he will send one, right, to smash the head of the serpent. Think about this with Isaac and Jesus. Both were actually miracle babies. Isaac was born to a 90-year-old barren woman. Jesus was born to a young virgin girl. Both Isaac and Jesus were sent from the Father. In verse 2, we can see that both Isaac and Jesus were loved deeply by their fathers. And in verse 2, we can also see that both Isaac and Jesus were their only sons. Isaac was the only son, referring to promise. We can look at verse 3, where it tells us that both Isaac and Jesus were accompanied by men to their sacrifice. 2 men for Isaac, 2 men for Christ on either side of the cross. We can look at verse 4 here of this text and see that Isaac had a 3-day journey to sacrifice, just like Jesus himself had a 3-day journey to die and then 3 days later rise again. We can look at verse 6, where we can see that Abraham put the wood on Isaac's back to carry to his sacrifice, just like Jesus carried his own cross to his own death. We can see Isaac on the altar with his father and Jesus hang on the cross, that both of them submitted to the will of their fathers, even though they could have said no. We can see in verse 7 that Isaac asked the question, we have the wood, Dad. We have the fire. Where's the lamb for the sacrifice? And we can see Jesus on the cross literally asking, why have you forsaken me, Father? You see, there's so many similarities. Jesus is throughout this whole entire text. It's wild to me, yet there's some significant differences. Let me share one with you that's important. There's a big difference between Isaac and Jesus, and one of those is this, is that God did not stop the sacrifice of Christ. He didn't stop it. Jesus was absolutely slaughtered for you, and he was slaughtered for me. And the good news in that is this, is that the grave couldn't actually hold him. He came out victorious over sin and death. And this is the gospel message in 3 simple words, that Jesus saves sinners. This is good news, friends, for the desperate. That Jesus truly does change everything, which means that our only response can be one thing. Romans chapter 10, verse 9. It says this, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord, and you believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. What a verse. What are we called to do? We're called to believe. What does it mean to believe? It means to agree with God that you don't have what you need and that he is the very one you absolutely need. So the question is, do you believe in Jesus? Because to believe is to agree that you are a sinner, that you desperately need help, that you're hopeless and helpless apart from him, that this world's not the answer. It can't actually give you what you want. It can't change your eternal outcome. Only he actually can. It reveals to us that you and I have a debt that we could not pay, that we needed someone to invade our mess, right? To die our death, right? To rise out of our grave and speak to our faces a message of victory, and that is possible because of Christ. Do you agree? That's what you have to wrestle with. Do you believe? And so as we close this morning, I just want to give you a moment in your seat, you and the Lord. And I don't know what you walked in with this morning on Easter 2023, but I know this, that Jesus is alive. And if Jesus is alive, that means everything he's ever said and done is true. And so the question is, do you know him? Do you have a relationship with him? And so right now in your seat, I'd like you to give you a moment between you and the Lord, just to confess whatever needs to be confessed. But if you don't know Christ, you can take a moment between you and him right now and confess your belief in him and ask him to forgive your sin and invade your life. Let's take a moment right now between you and the Lord.